The water trembled in the black depths of the Atlantic, 300 meters below the surface. Soviet submarine B-59 creaked under pressure. The temperature inside had risen above 45 degrees Celsius. Oxygen was thinning. Batteries were dying. The men were drenched in sweat, dizzy, silent. The hull shook with every nearby explosion depth charges. From an American destroyer patrolling above to the Soviet crew, the meaning was clear. They were under attack. The orders were already written. If under assault, with no contact from Moscow, the submarine had the right to retaliate with a nuclear torpedo. They had one. Below the control room, in the aft weapons bay, a single T-5 torpedo sat armed. It carried a nuclear warhead with the yield of Hiroshima. And in the command chamber, the voices of 3 officers rose in fury. Captain Valentin Savitsky, eyes bloodshot from exhaustion and rage, slammed his fist on the console. "They're trying to kill us. We're going to blast them to hell." To his left, the political officer agreed. "We must respond. The Americans have started the war." The final man in the triangle of command stood silent. Fleet Commander Vasili Arkhipov. He had equal authority. One of 3 signatures needed to launch. Savitsky was ready. The political officer was ready. Arkhipov was not. The boat shook again. Another charge, closer this time. Men screamed in the dark. Lights flickered. But Arkhipov didn't move. "No," he said finally. "We will not launch." Savitsky turned on him. "You're refusing an order." Arkhipov didn't answer. He just stared at the red-lit console, the command key still untouched, the launch chain incomplete. In that moment, Soviet doctrine froze. The most dangerous weapon in the ocean sat fully armed, ready to fire. The world balanced on one signature, and one man said no. Above them, the American ships had no idea. They thought they were signaling, forcing a surfacing, not knowing they were seconds from being vaporized. And in Moscow, the Naval High Command waited unaware that nuclear fire nearly answered a warning they hadn't sent. This wasn't a standoff. It was one breath from annihilation far above the Atlantic, deep within the Soviet Naval High Command in Moscow. Assumptions were ironclad. The doctrine was clear in the event of communications loss during conflict conditions. Captains of strategic submarines had full authority to defend themselves, including with nuclear weapons. No need to wait for confirmation. No time to wait. The system didn't trust silence. It trusted retaliation. In the command briefing room, red telephones lined the wall. A team of officers monitored American naval movements through long-range radio intercepts and naval intelligence. They tracked the U.S. quarantine line around Cuba. They logged aircraft carriers, destroyers, submarines, every NATO asset moving in the Caribbean. What they did not track was B-59. Contact had been lost 48 hours earlier, but no one panicked. The fleet commander noted it as routine submarines go dark during evasion. The assumption was that the crew would follow standing orders. If attacked, respond. If surrounded, surface. If forced, retaliate. The men in Moscow believed in the system. They believed in the captains they trained, the political officers they placed, and the warheads they assigned. They believed in the chain of command even when it was floating thousands of kilometers away. Under pressure, heat and fear, in a steel coffin surrounded by enemy destroyers. And when an American destroyer group near the quarantine zone began signaling with depth, charges harmless, small, meant only to communicate, Soviet high command never considered what that might feel like inside a submarine, out of oxygen and cut off from home. They believed those charges would be understood as warnings. They didn't realize those charges could be read as an act of war. The naval staff continued their simulations, blind to the growing crisis beneath the sea. Internal communications confirmed no orders had been issued to launch. No attack had been authorized. The hotline with Washington remained open. Khrushchev was still negotiating, but none of that mattered, because the protocol allowed a submarine, isolated and harassed, to use its own judgment, to strike back with nuclear force, and in their brightly lit war room, Soviet admirals never questioned that judgment. They assumed discipline, obedience, alignment. What they didn't account for, what no one expected, was that a man aboard that submarine would defy both logic and doctrine. They assumed the system would work, and that assumption brought the world to the edge. The Soviet Navy's submarine doctrine was ruthless in its simplicity, autonomy under fire. In a nuclear scenario, there would be no time for consultation, no room for debate. If a submarine commander determined that war had begun, he had both the authority and the obligation to strike. This doctrine, refined during the darkest hours of the Cold War, was built on two assumptions. First, that the enemy would move fast. Second, that Soviet systems could be blinded. Therefore, survival required initiative. The captains were not just weapons carriers. They were launch points. Submarine B-59, part of the October Storm Flotilla, had been deployed to the Caribbean to shadow the U.S. naval blockade around Cuba. The crew had strict orders. If communications with Moscow were lost and American forces attacked, they were to defend themselves using all available means, including the single nuclear torpedo stored on board. What made this doctrine uniquely dangerous was the internal launch procedure. Unlike land-based ICBMs, which required codes from the General Staff and multiple levels of authorization, the Soviet Navy used a three-man consensus model aboard its nuclear-capable submarines. Captain, political officer, flotilla chief, 2 out of 3. That's all it took to start World War III. The design was deliberate, in case one officer was killed or incapacitated. The other 2 could still act. It was built for speed and survivability, not reflection. But doctrine had no place for dissent. The logic was mechanized enemy attack equals counterattack. The system wasn't interested in interpretation. Submarines couldn't wait for orders that might never come. Their mission was clear: if you're under attack, and Moscow is silent, you retaliate. By late October 1962, that scenario became reality. For B-59, the crew had not heard from command in days. They had no idea whether Khrushchev was still negotiating or if Washington had already launched. Surrounded by American destroyers, enduring depth charge explosions, in suffocating heat and carbon dioxide, their world had narrowed to metal, sweat, and sonar. To Captain Savitsky, it was already war. He made his decision. He would launch. The political officer agreed. The 2 signatures were ready. The doctrine had done its job. The weapon was primed, and then Vasili Arkhipov refused. No third signature, no launch, no war. With that single dissent, the entire weight of Soviet naval doctrine was thrown into question, because the system built to eliminate doubt had just been stopped by it. What was designed to be automatic had become human again. The room reeked of sweat, machine oil, and carbon dioxide. Inside B-59, the lights glowed a dim, suffocating red. The air recyclers had begun to fail. The temperature had passed to 45 degrees. Some sailors lay motionless, too weak to stand. Others wiped condensation from control panels just to read the instruments. Then, the pressure wave hit. A depth charge small. Non-lethal. Meant only to signal detonated near the bow. The hull groaned. Metal screamed. A sudden jolt sent crew tumbling. For the Soviet sailors, it was unmistakable. They were under attack. Captain Savitsky snapped. They're trying to force us to the surface. They're attacking. This is it. The command chamber went into motion. Officers rushed to battle stations. The weapons crew received orders to prepare the T-5 torpedo, their single nuclear payload, stored aft, its yield roughly 15 kilotons, enough to vaporize a carrier group. Soviet doctrine said this was the moment. The crew didn't need a message from Moscow. Their training was clear if isolated, if under pressure, if attacks strike. The men moved like clockwork. Torpedo hatches were checked. Final codes were read aloud. 2 signatures awaited confirmation. The last, the flotilla commander, Vasili Arkhipov, stood silent. Captain Savitsky turned to him. We must launch. We die down here. Or we die up there. Arkhipov didn't answer. Another depth charge rumbled the hull. Some crewmen flinched. Others closed their eyes. They had no idea that above them, the American destroyers were deliberately holding back, signaling, not attacking. The U.S. Navy had no idea the submarine was armed with nuclear weapons. They thought they were forcing a surfacing. Instead, they were inches from provoking a world-ending launch. Arkhipov raised his head. If we launch, he said, we start a war we cannot control. Savitsky stared at him. They've started it already. They haven't. Arkhipov replied, not yet. He moved to the console, slowly, deliberately. Then he removed his hand from the launch key. The room froze. The other officers shouted, argued, begged. But Arkhipov held his ground. He outranked Savitsky. He had command authority, and he had just refused the apocalypse. Below decks, the torpedo was stood down. Power was withdrawn. The launch tube sealed. No missiles flew that day. No mushroom cloud bloomed over the sea. Inside the submarine, the temperature kept rising. The air stayed thin, but the weapon stayed silent. It was impossible. By design, by doctrine, by every line of policy, Arkhipov should have agreed. But he didn't. He stopped the launch, alone, and no one in Moscow knew it had happened. When B-59 finally surfaced, days later, the sea was quiet. The American ships kept their distance. The standoff had broken. The worst had passed. Above the waves, the crew gasped fresh air for the first time in 4 days. Below deck, Vasili Arkhipov stood motionless beside the conning tower. He had aged in hours. The submarine limped back toward Soviet waters, but as soon as they re-established contact, the reports began coded, terse, clinical. Contact with hostile force, use of depth charges, defensive weapon system primed, no launch executed, decisions stayed by flotilla officer. Those words traveled fast. When the Soviet Naval High Command received them, silence followed, then disbelief. Why hadn't they launched? The Americans had surrounded a Soviet nuclear submarine, dropped explosives in international waters, blocked all communication. Doctrine dictated that a counterstrike was not just permissible, it was expected. In the offices of the Ministry of Defense, senior admirals were furious. They hadn't authorized a launch, but they also hadn't expected to be asked. The protocol existed to bypass delay, to enable commanders in the field to make war if war had come, to them. Archipov's decision was not restraint, it was insubordination. Behind closed doors, questions turned accusatory. Was he afraid? Had he cracked under pressure? Why had 2 out of 3 commanders followed protocol, and 1 defied it? They summoned Arkhipov for a debrief. He answered without deflection. He had refused to confirm the launch because he did not believe war had begun. He did not trust the silence. And he had believed that launching the nuclear torpedo would trigger a conflict from which there would be no return. It was the truth, and no one wanted to hear it. There were no commendations, no thanks, no public recognition. Instead, there was paperwork, petty reprimands, criticism of discipline aboard B-59, Arkhipov was quietly reassigned. No promotion, no position of command. The fact that he had prevented nuclear war was too destabilizing to acknowledge, because to admit it meant accepting that Soviet doctrine had nearly failed, that their systems, their protocols, their assumptions had all but delivered catastrophe, and that the only reason the world had not been reduced to radioactive ash was because one man said no. It didn't fit the model. It couldn't be rewarded. It couldn't even be discussed. So Moscow buried it and pretended it hadn't happened. The official narrative was rewritten before the submarine even returned to port. According to the new version, B-59 had executed a textbook evasion maneuver. The depth charges were non-lethal. The situation never escalated. The crew remained composed. The nuclear torpedo was never fully armed. There was no disagreement among officers, just protocol followed calmly under pressure. This was the version filed into Soviet archives. But the officers aboard B-59 knew better. So did a few inside naval intelligence who read the uncensored logs. But rather than confront the implications that a single man had overridden a nuclear launch, they crafted a theory more politically palatable. The Americans had been bluffing. The charges were simply submarine signaling procedures. Arkhipov hadn't refused to launch. He simply delayed until verification. No disobedience, no cracks in the system. It was cleaner that way. Senior officials even speculated that Arkhipov had misinterpreted the sonar readings, that he didn't realize how close the American destroyers had come. Perhaps, they suggested, he lacked resolve. Perhaps he hesitated out of fear, not judgment. Behind closed doors, whispers followed him. He had been overly cautious, not aggressive enough, not a leader to trust with future nuclear responsibilities. But these were projections, not analysis. What the theory avoided entirely was the core truth the doctrine had demanded launch. The system had armed the weapon. 2 officers had agreed. The procedures were in place, and Arkhipov had stopped it. That wasn't hesitation. That was rebellion against the script, against the strategy, against the mechanical logic of retaliation. But admitting that meant admitting the flaw in the system, that Soviet nuclear policy, at its most dangerous moment, had survived not because it worked, but because someone refused to follow it. So the theory stood. He hadn't disobeyed, he had misunderstood. He hadn't blocked a launch, he had deferred for review. And when B-59's crew was rotated and the logs sealed, that version became truth. But every man who stood in that command room, who felt the heat, who heard the order, who saw Archipov's hand hover over the console and then retreat, knew what had really happened. The system had come within seconds of doing what it was designed to do, and one man had broken it. When the first story lost momentum, a second, more insidious theory began to circulate, one that didn't just excuse the failure to launch, but redirected the blame entirely. It claimed that the Americans had hacked the submarine. Not directly, no cable intrusion, no magical signal, but through psychological manipulation, through deliberate exploitation of Soviet command uncertainty. KGB analysts briefed internal circles with this new line that Archipov's hesitation had been planted by a Western influence campaign. They cited intercepted Radio Free Europe broadcasts, Voice of America psychological operations, even rumors of targeted naval propaganda aimed at Soviet officers stationed abroad. The logic was thin, but politically useful. According to this view, Arkhipov had been primed to doubt. His mind had been softened, his discipline compromised. The Americans hadn't stopped the launch with sonar. They had stopped it with ideas. One internal report from the 9th Directorate proposed that American naval tactics during the Cuban blockade were designed not to provoke, but to confuse controlled escalation. The report said, is a method of strategic psychological pressure. The depth charges weren't an attack, they were a test of Soviet nerves. And Arkhipov failed. This explanation gained traction in the upper echelons of the security apparatus because it required no admission of internal fault. The doctrine wasn't wrong. The system wasn't flawed. The failure came from infiltration. From ideological corrosion, it was easier to blame invisible American influence than to face the truth that a Soviet commander had, with clear mind and deliberate intent, disobeyed nuclear launch procedure. The result was policy new psychological screening protocols for nuclear submarine crews, more political officers, more loyalty testing, new guidance that discouraged individual moral interpretation during weapons authorization. Autonomy was now dangerous. Doctrine had to be absolute. But none of these changes addressed the real issue that the system demanded blind obedience, and yet relied on human restraint to survive its own design. Arkhipov was now a ghost in the bureaucracy, a lesson no one was allowed to cite. His refusal to launch became not a story of restraint, but a case file of ideological failure. They were solving a problem that didn't exist. One later intelligence officer remarked, years after the Cold War ended, because the real problem wasn't sabotage, it wasn't American psychology, it was us. But by then, it was too late. The wrong theory had already become doctrine, for all its submarines, satellites, and signals intercepts. The Soviet Union never truly knew what had happened in those 3 days beneath the sea. From the moment B-59 submerged in the eastern Atlantic, contact was lost. No bursts of coded radio, no sonar pings, no position updates. The submarine had gone dark just as trained and disappeared into the vast, unmapped thermoclines where sonar bent, and voices could not reach. The GRU scrambled to track its fleet, but the American blockade had scattered Soviet movements. The U.S. Navy deployed destroyers in unpredictable patterns, hunting submarines without announcing they were doing so. Soviet Naval Command couldn't keep up. When the depth charges began falling near B-59, no one in Moscow even knew she was within the blast radius. No satellite picked it up. No spy reported it. No fleet signal confirmed it. They were blind. And it wasn't just B-59. Multiple Soviet submarines deployed near Cuba lost contact for hours or days. In every case, Moscow could only guess where they were, what they were doing, or what they were facing. The Americans, for their part, had no idea the submarines carried nuclear weapons. They thought the charges they dropped were gentle, tactical nudges to signal surfacing. They didn't know they were knocking on the hull of a boat with a nuclear warhead in its launch tube, crewed by men hallucinating from heat and carbon dioxide buildup, believing that World War III had already begun. It was a failure on both sides, but the Soviet intelligence apparatus paid the price. After B-59 surfaced and its logs were reviewed, the magnitude of what had nearly happened became undeniable. The GRU's own analysis stated bluntly, had Arkhipov not withheld his authorization, the launch would have proceeded. Given the state of communications, it is likely this would have been interpreted as a first strike. Yet no one had predicted it. No one had prevented it, because Soviet intelligence had failed to monitor the psychological state of its crews, failed to anticipate how American signaling might be misread, failed to maintain contact with its own most dangerous weapons. And most of all, they had failed to understand that giving launch authority to men placed in pressure cookers, under siege, without information or oversight, was an invitation to catastrophe, To fix this, they implemented new procedures, more frequent check-ins, stricter political supervision, automated stress monitoring. But it all came after the fact, after the weapon was armed, after the launch order was nearly given, after the only barrier to nuclear war had been a man no one trusted enough to thank. The most advanced submarine fleet in Soviet history had nearly ended the world, and its creators didn't even realize it until the crew came home. They were looking at a ghost. The Americans never heard the order, never saw the red lights, never knew how close they came to being erased. To them, it was just a tense day during the Cuban Missile Crisis, October 27, 1962. Another destroyer run, another evasive submarine, another set of depth charges tossed into the sea. What they didn't know was that 30 seconds earlier, a Soviet nuclear torpedo had been armed, awaiting one final confirmation to launch. What they didn't know was that their signals, meant to communicate, were almost interpreted as an act of war. But that ignorance may have been their greatest defense, because the American naval strategy in the Caribbean, unlike the Soviet posture, was built around ambiguity, not escalation. Navy destroyers had been ordered to locate Soviet submarines and pressure them to surface, but they were forbidden from direct attack. The depth charges used were signaling round small, timed for minimal threat, intended to say, "We see you. Surface now." The Americans didn't know the Soviet submarines carried nuclear weapons. If they had, the entire strategy would have changed. But ignorance became restraint. That restraint extended beyond the sea. In Washington, the Joint Chiefs had urged airstrikes. In Florida, nuclear-armed B-47 bombers waited on alert. But President Kennedy delayed. He refused to authorize the first shot. In the war rooms of the Pentagon, the doctrine remained, do not provoke. Do not push them into a corner, where Soviet systems defaulted to reaction. The Americans hedged. Kennedy and his advisors were guided by a chilling understanding that in crisis, clarity disappears and overreaction is fatal. Their system, therefore, prioritized redundancy over speed. More checks, more signatures, more analysis. Used ballistic missile submarines operated under stricter control. No one captain could authorize a launch. Communication with the National Command Authority was mandatory. Delay was designed into the process. They accepted the risk of being second to strike because they believed that being first by mistake was worse. The American system wasn't smarter. It was more afraid. And fear, in this case, was wisdom. What the Soviets mistook for weakness hesitation. Indecision was, in truth, the only thing preventing Armageddon. While Soviet doctrine empowered the battlefield to make world-ending choices in silence, American doctrine distrusted everyone, including itself. This difference saved millions. Because the night B-59 nearly fired, Washington didn't respond with missiles. They responded with nothing. There was no chain reaction, no escalation, just silence. The American system hadn't neutralized the Soviet weapon. It hadn't intercepted, jammed, or confused. It had simply waited, and in that pause, that space between panic and retaliation, Vasili Arkhipov found the room to breathe and to say no. The United States didn't outgun the Soviets that day. They outweighted them, and they survived, not through superiority, but through restraint. There was no ceremony when B-59 returned, no flags, no music, no triumphant welcome, just a quiet docking at a northern naval base, far from public view. The men disembarked in silence, pale, shivering, exhausted. The mission was over. The danger had passed, but the shame had just begun. Captain Savitsky submitted his log with clipped brevity. Contact with hostile forces. Depth charges encountered. Launch procedure initiated, not executed. There was no mention of voices raised, no record of the shouting, no entry describing the near mutiny, when Arkhipov refused to give the final consent. But the political officers knew. The fleet commanders knew. The general staff knew. And they were furious. The Soviet Navy had entrusted its submarines with world-ending power. It had written protocols to ensure discipline, to prevent hesitation. But what they saw in Archipov's actions was not courage. It was insubordination. He had defied the two-man majority. He had humiliated the doctrine. And most devastating of all, he had been right. That reality couldn't be absorbed. So the humiliation was buried. In debriefings, Arkhipov was coldly interrogated, not congratulated. Why hadn't he followed the captain's order? Why had he doubted the censors? What made him think he knew better than protocol? He answered calmly, "Because I was not convinced. Because I wanted to live. And because I did not want my children to live in ashes." The room had no reply, but that didn't matter. The narrative had already been decided. Archipov's name was scrubbed from internal success reports. His role was minimized. The official documents reduced the near launch to a tactical disagreement. Savitsky, the man who nearly fired the nuclear torpedo, remained in good standing. He had followed orders. Arkhipov had not. That was the logic. To admit otherwise would be to admit that the system was flawed. That judgment had value. That emotion, not procedure, had saved the world, and that was unacceptable. The humiliation wasn't just personal, it was institutional. The Soviet military had handed a nuclear weapon to a crew submerged, cut off, suffocating, and almost paid the price. The strategic elite saw this clearly, but couldn't afford to say it, so they turned away. No medals were given, no lessons were published. Archipov's name faded into obscurity. A man tolerated, not honored, but among those who had been there in the stifling heat, in the roaring dark of the Atlantic deep, there was no confusion. They had heard the order, they had prepared the weapon, and they had watched one man stand alone and say the word no one else could deny it. At the near launch of B-59's nuclear torpedo cracked more than protocol. It fractured an entire ideology. For decades, the Soviet military system had clung to a central truth. War could be controlled. The tools of destruction, rockets, submarines, torpedoes were mere extensions of doctrine, bound by hierarchy, discipline, and logic. The state dictated reality. The individual obeyed. But Vasili Arkhipov shattered that illusion. Because in that critical moment, he was not a gear in the machine. He was the machine, and he chose to stop it. The incident exposed the dangerous contradiction at the heart of Soviet deterrence. They demanded obedience to a doctrine that left no space for human error, yet they survived only because of a human refusal to obey. It wasn't just a tactical failure, it was a strategic paradox. How could a system be trusted to launch if it couldn't be trusted to hold? And how could it hold if it punished restraint? Inside the naval academies and war colleges, this question never appeared in textbooks, but among senior officers, the realization spread like a silent contagion. They began to understand that deterrence based on immediate retaliation was no longer survivable in a world where signals could be misread, pressure could suffocate reason, and single actors could be cut off from command. Soviet ideology had always positioned itself as the rational counterforce to Western aggression. But B-59 proved that rationality could be undone by pressure, especially when wrapped in protocol. To admit that Arkhipov had saved the world was to admit that their system had nearly ended it. So they buried him in silence and doubled down. More control, more political officers, more automation, less autonomy, but none of it addressed the core failure that their system had placed nuclear judgment in a steel coffin, surrounded by explosions and expected perfection. The next time, would there be another Arkhipov? No one knew, and that uncertainty, unspoken, unresolved, hung like radiation over the remainder of the Cold War. Because once you know your system is flawed, but can't admit it, you're not in control anymore. He was forgotten before he was even understood. Vasili Arkhipov returned to duty, finished his career quietly, and died in 1998, known only to a handful of historians, as a senior officer aboard a Cold War submarine. No medals, no parades, no headlines. But the silence he left behind echoed louder than any explosion. It wasn't until decades later, when Soviet archives cracked open and the Cold War thawed into textbooks, that the truth emerged. That one man trapped in a steel furnace at the bottom of the sea had refused to ignite the end of the world, and the world never even knew. Today, his story survives not in monuments, but in shadows. He isn't taught in military academies. His name isn't etched on the walls of national heroism. But in nuclear war planning, in new fail-safe protocols, in submarine command policies worldwide, his ghost lingers. Because Arkhipov proved a truth so dangerous it had to be buried, that deterrence only works if someone, somewhere, is brave enough to stop it. He broke the chain, not with rebellion, but with restraint. He disobeyed not out of cowardice, but clarity. And in doing so, he saved hundreds of millions of lives. The Cold War had many villains, many warriors, many myths. But in the deepest moment of risk, its fate was decided by a man who chose not to press a button, not to follow a rule, not to believe the machine. One man. 3 signatures required. 2 were ready, but the last said no.